Chairman Ezell, Ranking Member Carbajal, Ranking Member Larson, members of the subcommittee. Thank you for the opportunity to discuss our recent work on commercial applications of autonomous ship technologies. Many commercial vessels today operate with some level of autonomous technology. Systems exist that can run certain ship functions or provide navigation and decision support. All current uses, though, have a human or humans who are in control or can take control if needed. As the technology develops, new cases will emerge for higher levels of autonomy. For example, companies have explored the business case for uncrewed short-distance cargo hauling and passenger transport, and there's currently a pilot program evaluating autonomous operation of vessels for at-sea rocket recovery. To date, Coast Guard has relied on its existing regulatory authorities to address these technologies as they emerge. These regulations allow for the testing of autonomous ships, provided the operator makes a request. Requests are typically made to the captain of the port, who is the Coast Guard officer responsible for activities within a designated area. Coast Guard issued guidance in 2024 for how captains of the port should deal with these requests. Under that guidance, the captain of the port evaluates proposals to assess the risks and applies existing regulations on a case-by-case basis. The captain of the port forwards these requests with a recommendation for approval or disapproval to the commandant. At the time of our report in August 2024, just a handful of requests had been made. Since then, Coast Guard has received 48 such requests and reported that they were able to manage the operations at the local level in all cases. The guidance also makes clear that testing of autonomous ships cannot be conducted in a way that reduces the number of crew below what is prescribed in statute. To monitor the development of autonomous ships and whether any changes to existing regulations or authorities are warranted, Coast Guard has an internal advisory committee, AutoPoco, who meets regularly to identify any legal, regulatory, or policy gaps and engages with industry stakeholders. At the time of our report, Coast Guard had determined that existing regulations were sufficient to deal with the requests it had received. Coast Guard emphasized that its policy is to only consider a new regulation when an existing statute or regulation cannot adequately address a need. However, as technology develops and autonomous operations are envisioned without crew on board, with remote crew, or with reduced crew levels, challenges to the existing legal framework will emerge. As I mentioned, Coast Guard cannot legally allow operations with fewer crew than is established in law. Further, any statute based on the assumption that humans are on board will present challenges. For example, it is not clear how autonomous ships without crew can comply with collision regulations, which require that every vessel has a lookout by sight and hearing. To evaluate whether the ships can safely operate with reduced remote or no crew, Coast Guard officials told us they would need to see actual examples of autonomous ships performing those functions, but so far there haven't been many. This may be because the technology is still being developed, some companies are unwilling to share proprietary information, or they're discouraged from testing because of the additional costs of complying with crew requirements. Furthermore, while Coast Guard's guidance encourages vessel owners and operators to keep records of their testing, Coast Guard would only receive information on the results of those tests at the discretion of industry. Ultimately, this is information that Coast Guard would need to fully evaluate whether the technology is safe. Internationally, IMO is currently developing a voluntary framework that addresses a variety of regulatory gaps, such as clarifying the human role in autonomous operations. Coast Guard has been involved in the development of this framework, leading several of the initiatives. As was mentioned, the framework is to be finalized for voluntary adoption in 2026, with an aim to develop and finalize mandatory guidelines by 2032. Other countries have experienced similar challenges to the Coast Guard in regulating autonomous ships, but they've taken slightly different approaches given that they have different legal authorities and different proposed uses in their waters. For example, the Norwegian maritime regulator was able to work with a company who developed an autonomous container vessel to test the safety of its technology, and after successful testing, they were able to reduce crew requirements. In Canada and the UK, maritime regulators have both developed specific guidance and regulations for small autonomous ships below 12 meters and 24 meters respectively, which allow remote operation and an alternative approval process. These are actions the Coast Guard would not be able to take without changes to its statutory authority. However, at the time of our report, none of the regulators we spoke to, including Coast Guard, were planning to pursue legislative changes until after the IMO finalizes the regulatory framework. Mr. Chairman, this concludes my statement. I'd be happy to answer any questions you have. Thank you.